I'll just start and say that I'm Derrick Cartwright. I'm the Director of Curatorial Affairs at the Timken, and it's nice to have this opportunity to be in dialogue with a friend and a great scholar, Tatiana Sizonenko, who's agreed to join us to talk about a painting that is at the Timken, and all of our visitors will know it well. It's Bartolomeo Veneto's Portrait of a Lady in a Green Dress. Many of you who've been sort of following the Timken for the last year since we've been closed and are now in the middle of doing some renovations, looking forward very much to reopening, will know that we've tried to fill in that gap of contact with the collection by doing things like a work of the week project, which for a whole year we posted about the collection and did these curatorial corner sort of mini lectures. We decided we would change that up a little bit and try to do something different, because so many scholars throughout the world have written about objects in the Timken collection. And because I know Tatiana well, and because she's been so gracious to join us and has written about the Bartolomeo, I thought we would start this new, somewhat experimental dialogue with her. So let me just start off. I'll introduce you more fully in a moment, Tatiana, but I just want to say thank you and hi, it's nice to see you.
Hi, Derrick. Thank you so much for having me over. And of course, it's just a great joy to share my research with the audience. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think your research on this painting is incredible. So I want to get to that quickly, but I thought just to set it up for some of our audience, which may not know Bartolomeo Veneto well, he's a little bit of a mysterious figure. Would you agree, Tatiana? He's not especially well known.
Yeah.
We think he was probably born in Cremona, maybe, we're not sure. He worked in Venice and Ferrara, but died in Turin around 1531. So if you know the map of Italy, you know that's sort of the northern regions, Lombardy and the Veneto, and that's where he gets his name, Bartolomeo Veneto. He was a contemporary of Titian and Giorgione and Veronese, all of whom are working in that area in the early 16th century, but he's completely missing from let's just say some of the main sources like Vasari's Lives of the Artists. He doesn't show up, so he's interesting in there. Do you have any thoughts about that, Tatiana?
And that's a kind of a reason why his biography or interest about Bartolomeo Veneto disappeared from history, because there is no mention of him in any of the contemporary biographies. And obviously, because of some of the scholarship, particularly Laura Pagnotto, who published a catalog and identified a lot of the lost paintings of Bartolomeo Veneto, we actually know a little bit more about him now.
Yeah. And thanks to you, we know even more, which is great. But he's known for these smaller scale devotional works. Some people have suggested he might have been a student of Bellini's and copied some of Bellini's work. But again, it's been because of you and other scholars that we've gotten to know him a little bit better. But a lot of works are like this one I'm showing on the screen. They're unidentified. They're just portrait of a man. So we can speculate a little bit about who this man might have been and where he may have lived. But in fact, that's been the job of scholars like you to help us better understand this career. And there are about 30, maybe a few more works that, thanks to your scholarship and others, we believe are by Bartolomeo, and they live throughout the world, and we're lucky that one of them is in San Diego. But they cover a completely wide range of imagery, from maybe idealized figures like the women on the right and left of the screen to what seem to be noblemen. And you've written just about how sensitive Bartolomeo is to the conditions of fabric and textiles. And I think you see that in these works, right, Tatiana?
Yeah, absolutely. His ability to actually present these shimmering fabrics and manipulate the source of light and also put a spotlight on personality. Those are the best qualities of portrait painters of the 16th century that we see in Titian, we see in Leonardo da Vinci's work, we see in Lorenzo Lotta's work. And so Bartolomeo Veneto just fits right in his abilities to bring those sitters to life when he paints them. Yes.
I agree. And I guess the question is, we know something. For instance, this is a painting at the National Gallery of Art in London, which includes this wonderful scrolled paperwork and a signature and a date and even the identification of the sitter, which is hugely helpful, right? Now we actually know so much, not just about this man, but also about the circumstances under which someone like Bartolomeo may have been commissioned to do the
Yeah.
portrait. And of course, this shows up a couple of times in his work, as you know better than me. Sometimes these little scraps of paper, like in this example, which is actually in Washington, D.C., you look at the paper, which may have one day included that same information, but it's been effaced.
Yeah.
And that's a pity, because I guess, what do you think? Overzealous conservators scraped it off, or a later owner didn't like it, so they've changed it? What's your thought about that,
Well,
Tatiana?
it's just a condition of preservation. Some things fade because of colors faded away. I mean, that's a kind of normal decay. And I want to point out that those cartolini, those pieces of paper, they're very typical Venetian painting. And we, as you mentioned, some of the scholars identify Bartolomeo Veneto's career begins in Venice in the Bellini's workshops, and we see a lot of those kind of similarities in the way how sitters presented, particularly in Giovanni Bellini's work with those cartolini. It's very Venetian thing. And so it's very helpful because we know the dates, at least, and because of those inscriptions.
Yeah, and we're lucky because the Timkins painting, and this is how it looks today, it's actually at the Balboa Arts Conservation Center, getting a little bit of conservation treatment before we represent it to the public in a couple of, I hope, a few weeks. But it has one of these cartolinas,
Yes.
these inscriptions, which of course was, I guess, one of the hooks for you in trying to understand a little better. It's also been slightly scrubbed, but I think there's enough for you to read the date very clearly, and Bartolomeo Venetti, I think.
Yeah, Venetti. Bartolomeo Venetti. That's the inscription.
So we know a little bit about the history of the painting, that it was in this important Maffrin collection in Venice, at least until the 1880s, and then was in the collection of the fifth Earl of Rosebery in Mentmore, and it was acquired by the Timken in 1979, and it's pretty much been in San Diego since. It's a work on panel and can't really travel very easily because it's so delicate. But you noticed something, and I'm just going to show quick slide. It's not just the front of the painting, the back of the painting has information too. And since we had unframed it and had it over at BACC, I did some new, or had some new photography made. Catherine Noland did this nice job of taking a cell phone image of these seals, which maybe you could say something about that, Tatiana. They're
Yeah.
not uncommon.
Yeah, so those seals actually reflect the history of ownership. And
Mhm.
so some of the seals have to do with the catalog of Manfred collection, and some of the those paper things that we see as well, they have to do with the dealers who sold the painting. But the most important one, this is the early one, which is the wax seal that seems to be dated to the 16th century or 17th, or something quite earlier, which is different from the 19th century, which I was working with to try and identify. And I linked it with the possibly maybe the Gonzaga family in Mantua. And I would like to say that this painting is so important in this in scholarship about Bartolomeo Veneto because of this painting that was in Manfred collection. It was the artist was identified. Yes, if it was not for this painting, we would have not known about Bartolomeo Veneto at all.
Wow.
And yeah, so the essentially Timken Museum painting is basically the touchstone to really know that there was an artist, Bartolomeo Veneto, because it was featured in the guidebooks about Venice and Venetian collections in the 19th century. And all of the collectors began to pay attention to this unusual and really unknown master that they knew nothing about. And then they were able to identify a couple of other portraits in the 19th century that was attributed because of inscriptions to Bartolomeo Veneto. And that's how this whole career began to be reconstructed of his work. And so for me, it was a big finding for myself to realize, oh my God, he is in the Balboa Park. It's a really critical piece for scholarship about Bartolomeo Veneto.
Yeah. Well, I just love in your article, which we'll talk about in a minute, just the sleuthing that you did to bring these things together is, I think, one of the great pleasures of art history, and you've done it.
And I checked on inventories of Manfred collection, also trying to see where he could have gotten the piece, because that is kind of lost in history a little bit. But it was very interesting. So when I made this kind of a leap because of the identification of the seal to the collections of the Gonzaga family collections. And the Gonzaga family collections, when they were sold in the 17th century, they sold to European owners, and they were shipped through Venice. And so that was a kind of another important interesting fact, how this painting could have gotten to Venice, because some of the pieces from the Gonzaga family collections, they were actually lost a little bit in Venice. So not all of them were shipped to European collectors. So, and that's how I suggested that this painting could have gotten to Manfred, or he bought from the Gonzaga family, because it was sold to different owners when it was just basically sold.
Well, I thought that part of your research was so fascinating. And we've studied, I think you've already mentioned Laura Pagnotta's research on the portraits, which was a project that took place at the Timken back in 2002. And then even as recently as 2018, we've involved local artists like Bob Nameta, who's made the Veneto portrait into a kind of subject for her own contemporary artwork. So it's a work we've studied, but nobody I know of has peered as deeply into it as you have, Tatiana. So I thought I would just first, for our audience who may want to learn more about Bartolomeo's work, I created a little bit of bibliography, which includes some articles, most importantly, your article, which is the reason why we're having this conversation, which you published in California Italian Studies back in 2016, which solving the mystery of the sitter in the Bartolomeo Veneto portrait of a lady in a green dress, which I think I'll give a link to that at the end of this talk. But I thought now I would introduce you, and I'm sorry I've been talking to you as if you're an old friend, because you are, but for our audience, I just wanted to explain that you're an art historian who received your PhD at UC San Diego and studied Renaissance art history there. You've taught and teach at Cal State University San Marcos and San Diego Design Institute and many places. I think we first met when you were teaching at USD.
Yeah.
You've had numerous fellowships from the Getty, from UCSD and other institutions, and you're currently, this is not your major project. Bartolomeo is not your major thing, although you've done a lot of research about him. You're writing a book entitled, I think, The Myth of Roman Imperium Outside of Italy, Constructing Rulership in Eastern Mediterranean from 1450 to 1550. But you're also a curator yourself, and one of the things I admire about you is just your breadth and how wide you practice as an art historian. You have this project coming up in the Getty's Pacific Standard Time exhibition, this region-wide program in 2024, which will look at the environmental art of Helen and Newton Harrison, which I can't wait to see that, Tatiana. That's going to be good.
Yeah, it will be a retrospective in a way that Newton said that he didn't want to have retrospective, but now he's having.
Yeah.
So it will be interesting. There will be a lot of surprises, actually.
You can't complain now, right?
No, no.
Just to be clear, that's not a portrait of you. That's another one of
Yeah.
Bartolomeo's unknown women, although it's been posited that it may be someone named Cecilia Gallerani. So I wanted to sort of turn it over to you now, Tatiana, as the expert. And you posit that this sitter, this previously unknown sitter, might be this woman, Maria Paleologo. And I wondered if you could just take us a little bit through the argument.
Yeah. So when I started to look at this portrait, and it was happened to be sort of a nice arrangement I had between UCSD's Visual Arts Department and the Timken Museum to come and do something about the collection. And so I was invited by John Wilson to look at this particular portrait of Maria Paleologa. I mean, of the lady in the green dress. And one of the reasons, because I was writing my dissertation about Gentile Bellini and portraiture, Northern Renaissance portraiture, particularly Mehmed II portraiture, which was my dissertation about. And I was doing a lot of research into Italian portraiture, and particularly the way how identity of the sitter is presented in Italian portraiture, and how different artists approach representations of likenesses, and to what extent those likenesses could be assigned to realism of in the sitter's portrayal, or it could be a constructed likeness that could be a symbolic, having different kind of symbolic elements. And so this portrait really intrigued me very much. And I started looking at certain characteristics. First of all, some of the details that we see have to do with the whole kind of costume of the sitter. Is so unusual. It's unlike anything that you find in Northern Renaissance portraiture. So she has this kind of very golden, shimmering, so-called bavero. It's a silky cover of her shoulders. It has a pomegranate design. And for me, it was very interesting, kind of, because I have studied in my past Byzantine art, and for me, those kind of the combination of gold and pomegranate, I was thinking, okay, some kind of Eastern style and influences. And then she has this really beautiful, like turban-like um, arrangements of her coiffure. And I started looking into that and thinking, what exactly is that? Like, what, I mean, again, it's so unusual and so striking in the appearance. And I started looking at scholarship that reflected on understanding of this coiffure, and I came across, of course, that in fact there was this different fashions in Italy for women's turbans, and this is a kind of like a turban, but it's not like a turban at the same time. And so this is what I'm writing in my article about, that I kind of classified all these different costume elements into, they're called scuffie in Italian language and scuffiotti. And scuffie, they could be different kind of turbans, soft turbans. And then other kind of scuffiotti, they were actually made from, with a wire mesh. They actually included the natural hair and also ribbons and jewels. And this is a kind of the second type that I was able to identify, that this particular one has this kind of really kind of a very solid form, and also has the jewels and ribbons. And I came across archival correspondence that was published in the end of the 19th century, that was actually talking about scuffiotti that was made fashionable by Isabella d'Este. And this Isabella d'Este identity always been a focus of attention of many scholars because of this portrait by Titian. It's a very famous portrait. It's a retrospective portrait of Isabella d'Este. She was 62 years old when it was painted, but she looks very young and beautiful, and she wears this kind of turban-like designed hairpiece. And I started investigating Isabella d'Este's Scuffiotti, and in fact discovered that she even patented them. She patented them. So she had a kind of like a copyright law that prohibited making this kind of wigs. Essentially, this is a wigs that she made with hair and jewels. We can see that this one also has a jewel right in the center.
Right.
So that's a jewel. And it's also ribbons and hair. And apparently there is a whole kind of fascinating story about Isabella d'Este giving gifts of this Scuffiotti, the hair pieces, to different members of her extended relationships. Those people that she deemed high-standing people that she wanted to give a gift. And then she also apparently gave gifts, all of this Scuffiotti, to her daughters-in-law, that women that were supposed to be coming into the family as a brides. And it's all very much documented by archival correspondence that I was reading. And I was thinking about, oh, how interesting that it's actually, there is a whole story about these hair pieces that became very fashionable in this circle of Isabella d'Este. And of course, given that Bartolomeo Veneto, he was working in Ferrara, he was working in Milan, so he was actually working in all these areas. I found it was very interesting because I found that there was a prominent family in near Milan, which is a duchy of Monferrato, and the daughters of this William IX, who was Marquis of Monferrato, they were future brides of Isabella d'Este, Federica Gonzaga. And because of those kind of archival evidence that my investigation into these hair pieces, I identified that, in fact, the hair piece that we see in the portrait of the Lady of a Green Dress in the Timken Museum, this should be identified as a kind of this Isabella d'Este Scuffiotta. And there is another second clue that I have took into consideration, which is the date that we see on the cartellina. We started with that, which is 1530. And this is a very interesting date, because when I started to investigate the date itself in the context of this all the Scuffiotti business, hair pieces, it happened that this was the date when Maria Paleologa, who was the heiress of the Duchy of Monferrato, so she was arranged to be married to Federica Gonzaga, son of Isabella d'Este. And in fact, it's documented that Isabella d'Este gave her a hairpiece as a gift, along with other gifts. However, and these negotiations happened exactly in the 1530, even though previously, it's a complicated story, it's very intriguing, and one should write a book about it. So
you could.
yeah. So apparently Maria Paleologa was first betrothed to Federica Gonzaga when she was 8 years old. It's 1517, and he fell in love with her. He actually, according from the letters, I'm not making it up. So he actually traveled multiple times to Monferrato to check on his future bride. He gave her rings, and he actually gave her rings, so she basically married her on the spot. He kissed her when she was 8 years old, Maria Paleologa. And then something happened. In 1526, Federico Gonzaga, son of Isabella d'Este, he was in love with a mistress, Isabella Boschetti, who was a married mistress. And he was so in love that he decided to break off engagement with Maria. And then there was a complicated intrigue. So because of status hunting, all of this nobility in the 16th century, he was proposed by the Holy Roman Emperor to get married with an older woman, Julia de Aragon. And so that marriage was going on and already negotiated when the father of this brother of Maria died suddenly, and father died, and she became the heiress of the Duchy of Monferrato. And so she became this really important young bride that,
Wealthy too.
yeah, wealthy too. Yeah, so, and Federico Gonzaga immediately decides that he doesn't want anymore his engagement with Julia de Aragon. So he disconnects his relationship with the Holy Roman Emperor nonetheless. And he argues that he needs to resume his engagement with Maria Paleologa. And so he goes back, all these negotiations, and then there is one more event that happens, that she dies suddenly in September of 1530. Maria Paleologa dies, and then she has a younger sister, Margarita Paleologa,
Right.
Margarita Paleologa, that immediately becomes the bride of Federico Gonzaga. Isabella d'Este gives her all the gifts for the future bride, the hairpiece, the all kinds of jewels, and all the other things that come along according to correspondence, and she marries to Federico Gonzaga. So it's a very intriguing story in itself, but because of this portrait that been painted by Giulia Romano in 1531, and the reason why it's not Bartolomeo Veneto, perhaps because he probably passed away at that time, because Lady in the Green Dress is a final work by Bartolomeo Veneto as we know it today. And so this is painted by the court painter of the D'Este family, Giulia Romano. Um, and he paints this really beautiful portrait of Margherita Paleologa. It's been also recently identified by English scholars. That's in the collection of the Windsor Royal Collection Trust. And so we have a confirmation, which is letters that confirm those kind of relationship and arrangements that Isabella d'Este made for the future bride. And so I looked at this portrait again as a kind of a clue to think about the portrait of Lady in the Green Dress. It's a different, stylistically different portrait. Giulia Romano is a different artist. He has a very different influences, artistic influences. So we don't really have the same kind of pose and the spotlight that we usually see in Bartolomeo Veneto portraits. But here we have this clue, which is the hairpiece again. The hairpiece, which is of particular kind, which has the hair and the ribbons and the jewels in the middle, and also she holds, we cannot see in this portrait very well on the screen, but she holds the blue beads in her left hand. Yes, those beads. And if we go back to Bartolomeo Veneto's portrait, we see that she has this kind of beads around her neck. Those are beads. And the beads as well were a very fashionable object for the d'Este family. So they actually were acquiring those beads. We see also Federico Gonzaga, the famous portrait by Titian, where he holds the beads in his hand. And Isabella d'Este as well, she holds the beads in her hands somewhat. Yeah, this portrait, the previous screen, if you, yeah, you can see that there are beads in around his neck. Federico Gonzaga. Those are the blue, beautiful blue lapis lazuli beads. And I believe that Isabella also, I cannot see it quite right now, but I have seen it in other portraits of different portrait of Isabella d'Este, the later one, kind of a copy that also shows her with the beads. And so if we go back to the portrait of Bartolomeo Veneto, we can actually see here, it's not just the hairpiece. We actually see those beads. We have also this kind of style of very fluffy the sleeves that are very fashionable in the court of d'Este as well. Yes, because we see Margherita Paleologa, we see Isabella d'Este. And we see also, I found very interesting archival documentation describing, like, this is the undershirt that comes through the opening, so the opening of the sleeves, and it's embroidered with a block embroidery. That's very delicate. So
Okay.
Isabella have been known to have cultivated special Greek women who were working in her court, producing this kind of very delicate embroidery on white satin shirts for undergarments. So all of these kind of details, when I was looking into the fashion elements of this portrait, that actually made for me a quite clear sense. So this is not just an average sitter. We have so many clues that link this particular portrait with the circle of Isabella d'Este. And then this golden shimmering silky cover, Bavero, on her shoulders with pomegranate style is actually quite Byzantine, in fact, because if we look back at the history of William IX and family of Monferrato, they actually had Byzantine relationship with the Byzantine Paleologus family. That's why it's a Maria Paleologa. And so those are kind of very interesting, again, clues if you take seriously that the identity has been carefully constructed for this kind of portraits. And we know that most of the portraits like this, they were commissioned for a specific purpose, which is a wedding. And so this is a moment in a woman's life when she was shown and all of her important relationships, the family attributes, family heirlooms that would point out to her status, social status, her lineage, and those all elements, her connections. And so prominently, these kind of future brides, they would also display not only her own family heirlooms, but also the family of the groom, which those are gifts that would be donated as a part of the marriage negotiations. And so we see here, if we accept this kind of attribution that it has to do with Isabella d'Este, and we know from archival evidence that she did in fact gave gifts of those scuffiotti, those hair pieces. And that was very particular design of those scuffiotti that has to do with Isabella d'Este's identity, the way she saw it. So then we can at least arrive a little bit closer to understanding who is this mysterious woman is and why she's so splendidly presented here, because it's a really absolutely glorious kind of depiction of her likeness at her prime of her life that we see here.
That's so nice. So just to summarize, your argument is this is a wedding portrait. She died, so it was never really fulfilled its purpose, but it was the wedding portrait that then gets supplanted in a way by Giulio Romano's portrait of her sister, because she's actually, Margherita becomes just as attractive to the Gonzagas because she is now the heir to this immense fortune as well. I wondered, there are things like these details of the rings, and they both seem to wear them on the same fingers. This is a reversed
Yeah.
image here, but because it's a print, but I sort of saw these connections even in just the sort of display of the hands and the jewelry, besides the beads that you noticed and connected so well to the Gonzagas. That's, I think, such a great example of how there are still discoveries to be made in Renaissance art history. And it's so encouraging to know that, but also to just see the depth of research that you went to in order to make this identification. And I guess just to finish up, Tatiana, I wondered if you had any thoughts about the likelihood of being able to identify these other figures. All of these are unidentified figures within Bartolomeo's oeuvre. And since you've come up with this, I think, breakthrough identification for our painting, do you think somebody else now can do this for all the others that are out there in the world?
Well, some of them could be more allegorical figures. Yeah, so that would make
Certainly
very,
this one.
yeah, make it very difficult. some of them been identified with Lucrezia in Ferrara. So Lucrezia. Um, and again, some of them are made because there was a fashion in portraiture. Some of the fashion is presentation of the sitter is more disguised manner. It's like role play, and we know that in Bartolomeo Veneto, we see those references to sacred figures, and so those are maybe disguised portraits, and unless there are certain clues that can be analyzed specifically, and that we have some kind of archival evidence to do this kind of work, it would be very difficult to identify just based on looks, because it is a little bit, I think I probably wouldn't be able to do the work I did if there was no solid archival letters published before me, and those letters published by Lucio in the end of the 19th century. So they're actually not new publications, in fact, but they haven't been looked at in the context of, and then how can someone connect Bartolomeo Veneto and those letters about Isabella d'Este? It's kind of like, okay, if you are dealing with Isabella d'Este, you think about her. And if you're dealing with Bartolomeo Veneto, you think about him. And so kind of get those two and two together, you have to be looking a little bit wider. You have to net a little bit wider, wider net. And so I think I was very lucky that I got sort of really becoming more attuned to fashion. And so, and getting all this information about the fashion that came my way, all of a sudden that I saw all the wealth of interesting details that were not previously analyzed, and so that helped me tremendously. And so I think probably by being looking those fashion attributes of costumes that we see in Bartolomeo Veneto, because he's a kind of costume artist, I would say.
That's interesting. You see it here, I think, in this mosaic of his images.
Yes,
So
he is a costume artist. Yeah, so he has a lot of this kind of things that we don't see in a lot of other portraits, and probably this kind of road to actually analyze and see his those kind of details perhaps could be helpful to understand who was those clients that he painted. And a couple more things about these rings that we see very often on female hands, like it's prominent here in this portrait of Lady in the Green Dress. Yes, so she has two rings, one on the pinky finger. And so the pinky finger, I just think those are like engagement ring when she was 8 years old. Yeah, so the women were engaged very early, and then they went to marry. And so, and when we have those kind of engagement rings, we know that's a noble sitter. It's not just any kind of sitter, because that's only noble women of very high status. They actually were given that kind of privilege even to be engaged. Yeah, so ordinary women, they didn't have those kind of things happened in their lives. So because they didn't have the dowries, they didn't have the family who were interested. And so it only happened for really a few, those really special women whose destiny has been kind of thought ahead of their life. Yeah, so as soon as they were born, and if they were nice looking and promising, so their future has been thought about. And this is what we see here. Also points out to that this is not just any kind of a theater between us, but this is a very, very special person. And we have all this kind of, I think more so in this particular portrait, more so all these details that point out to us, given by the artist, that this is a very special person. It's not just a beautiful woman, not just an allegory, but this is a very particular person whose destiny has been discussed as she was painted by the artist. And then, of course, a lot of the docents in the Timken Museum, as I know, they love those falconier gloves.
Mhm.
Yeah, so those are kind of gloves, and obviously it's also the activities of nobility to participate and hunt and everything else. So I think it's very good reasons to think about. It's not just any kind of woman, but this is a woman that had this really privileged upbringing and privileged status in the northern Italian nobility.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Tatiana. That's just so revelatory, really, and encouraging. And thank you for sharing all of your research with the Timken. I did want to just point all the audience to the publication, which is available online, which I've read now several times and continue to admire. You can find it through UC Berkeley has this journal called California Italian Studies, and it's nicely available just through the internet. So I thought this would help people who want to go even deeper into this history that you've rewritten, give them that opportunity to do so.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. One more, I just wanted to mention detail. I
yeah,
forgot to mention that the whole thing of the Esther, in which I talk in my article, is actually has to do with the Roman roots of Isabella d'Este.
hmm,
On top of everything else, the whole kind of idea that she obviously came up with those scuffiotti. And that was for me very interesting in general, how the nobility of that time period, they appropriated historical references to really construct their fashion persona uh,
yeah,
in
that
one
was
circles.
that's so nice. Thank you for sharing all of this with us, and I'm really grateful to you again. And it seems like we see each other more on Zoom than we did when we were out living in the world. I hope that changes soon.
I hope so too. Thank you so much, Derrick. And it was a pleasure. And
Yeah,
absolutely. Thank you
thank
so
you.
much. Mhm. Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.